Michigan woman of Lynette Hooker.
Lynette Hooker.
Search for Lynette Hooker, Michigan mom who fell overboard while sailing with her husband in the Bahamas a month ago.
And I want to find Lynette.
According to Brian Hooker, his wife Lynette fell off the back of their dinghy, somewhere in the dark water between shore and their sailboat. He says the waves were rough. The wind was loud, and within seconds, she was gone. But no one heard a scream. No one saw her fall. And somehow, no one saw her in the water. But hours later, something turns up where it shouldn't. Sitting off to the side, facing out toward the ocean. Not moving much. He was not engaging, just staring. One witness later described it as pouting. Not angry. Not explosive. Just withdrawn. And this distance between them stood out. Because for nearly half an hour, they stayed like that. Separated. There was no visible interaction or shared conversation. Not even a sign that they were even there together. And this wasn't something people had to dig to remember. It was noticeable enough that strangers, people with no connection to them, held on to that moment. Because it didn't feel like a couple enjoying a night out. It felt like two people, existing in completely different versions of the same evening. There's one more detail that adds a strange layer to this. Some of those same witnesses believed they had seen Brian just days earlier, at a different bar. A man who made them uncomfortable. Someone described as acting odd, approaching people, trying to get them to the party. Now, to be clear, that identification isn't confirmed. It could be a coincidence. But the fact that they thought it might be him, made them pay closer attention that night. And that's why they remembered. Nothing dramatic happened. But something felt off. There was no shouting or argument. No scene. Just a quiet, visible distance. And sometimes, that kind of silence says more than anything else. Because when you look back on it now, knowing what happened later, That moment starts to feel less like coincidence and more like the beginning of something already unraveling. So this question lingers. If nothing was wrong, why were they acting like they weren't even together? Up to this point, everything is still explainable. A couple acting distant, an uncomfortable atmosphere, maybe a disagreement that never turned into a scene. But now, we get into something that's harder to ignore. Time. When you stop looking at emotions and start looking at time, the story begins to break. We know Brian and Lynette were both at the Abaco in that evening. And at 6:38 p.m., surveillance captures something important. They're seen together, walking toward the dock. This time, they were not separated or distant. They were together, both moving in the same direction, headed back toward the dinghy. At that moment, everything still fits. If you're following Brian's version of events, this is exactly what should be happening. They finish their evening. They walk down to the boat. They leave together. A simple order. Except, that's not what happens next. Because at 7 p.m., there's another image. Another timestamp. And this time, Brian is alone, walking on the same path, heading in the same direction. But Lynette is nowhere in sight. No one walking beside him. No one ahead of him. No one trailing behind. Just Brian moving toward the dock by himself. Now pause there for a second. Because between 6:38 p.m. and 7 p.m., something changes. And no one can clearly explain what. That's a 20-minute window. Not hours or overnight. Just 20 minutes. But in a case like this, 20 minutes is everything. Here's what we do know. Another group at the Abaco Inn, people who had their own dinghy tied up nearby, left earlier in the evening. They pulled away at around 6:30 p.m. And when they did, Brian and Lynette's dinghy was still there. Still tied up. Still untouched. Which means, by 6:38 p.m., when Brian and Lynette are seen walking down together, they hadn't left yet. They were still on land, still within that environment. A place where people could see them. But by 7 p.m., Brian is alone. And after that, there's no confirmed sighting of Lynette again. No one sees her get into the dinghy. No one sees her leave the dock. And no one sees her on the water. That's where the timeline stops behaving like a sequence and starts behaving like a gap. Because now we're left with possibilities, not answers. Maybe they separated intentionally. Maybe one of them went back to the bar, to the restroom, to grab something. That happens. It wouldn't be unusual. Or maybe one of them made it to the boat earlier, and the other followed behind. But there's a third possibility too. And it's the one that makes this timeline feel different. That something happened before they ever left. Because if Lynette was with Brian at 6:38 and gone by 7 o'clock, then whatever explains that gap has to fit inside those 20 minutes. And here's where it gets even more important. Because Brian's entire story, the fall, the water, the drift, all of it, depends on one key assumption: that they left the dock together. But the timeline doesn't confirm that. And once that assumption starts to weaken, everything that comes after it becomes harder to trust. So now we're not just asking what happened on the water. We're asking something earlier. Something more precise. If they were supposed to leave together, where was Lynette when Brian walked away alone? Up till now, we've only been looking at what others saw. The distance at the pool. The gap in the timeline. The moment Brian was seen walking alone. But now, we shift perspective. Because to understand this case, you have to understand the story Brian told. Not pieces of it. not interpretations. The full version, exactly as he described it. According to Brian, the evening followed a simple sequence. After spending time at the Abaco Inn, he and Lynette returned to their dinghy. He places their departure at around 7:30 p.m. They untie from the dock and begin heading back toward their sailboat. It's a short route, just a few minutes across the water. A routine trip they'd likely made many times before. But then something goes wrong. Brian says that shortly after leaving, Lynette bounced off the back of the dinghy. She didn't slip or lean too far. Bounced. As if the motion of the boat, combined with the conditions, was enough to throw her over. He described the water as rough, that waves were between 2 and 4 feet high, and that the wind was strong enough to make control difficult. The kind of conditions that, in his words, made everything happen fast. And in that moment, he says Lynette wasn't just thrown into the water. She also pulled something with her. The dry bag. And more importantly, the engine key attached to a lanyard. According to Brian, as she went overboard, the lanyard yanked the key free from the engine, which meant the motor shut off instantly. So now, in his version of events, everything compounds. Lynette is in the water. The engine is dead. The wind is pushing the boat. The waves are rising. And Brian is left drifting. He said he tried to find her, but visibility was poor. The light was fading. And in the movement of the water, he quickly lost sight of her. From there, the situation turns into survival. Brian claims he drifted for approximately 9 hours, carried by wind and current across open water, through the night, until eventually, he reaches land. He washes ashore at Marsh Harbor, alone, after what he describes as a long, uncontrolled drift. That's the story. Start to finish. A sudden accident. A loss of control. A night of survival. And on the surface, it sounds plausible. Tragic, but plausible. Because accidents at sea do happen. People do fall overboard, boats can lose power, and conditions can change quickly. But here's where the story becomes fragile. Not because of what Brian says happened, but because of what needs to be true. For that version to work, the waves have to be rough. The wind has to be strong. The visibility has to be poor. Because those conditions explain everything. They explain the fall. They explain the loss of control. They explain why he couldn't find her. So if those conditions weren't there, then the entire explanation starts to fall apart. And that brings us to the next step. Because when investigators and witnesses looked at the environment that night, they didn't see chaos. No one saw danger. They didn't see anything close to what Brian described. The world did not behave the way Brian described. So now the question shifts. If everything happened that quickly, why doesn't the environment support his version? Up until now, Brian's story has one thing holding it together. The conditions. Because if the water was rough, if the wind was strong, visibility was poor, then everything else starts to make sense. The fall, the panic, the loss of control, even the fact that he couldn't find her. But when people went back and looked at that night, the ocean told a different story. Not a dramatic one. The ocean wasn't chaotic. It was just calm. Multiple witnesses who were on the water that same evening described the conditions the same way. Not rough. Not dangerous. Just steady, manageable water. One person who had been traveling along that exact stretch of coastline said something simple. We wouldn't have gone out if it was like that. And they weren't alone. Others who were boating nearby, moving between docks, passing through the same area Brian described, reported no sign of extreme conditions. Then there's the video. Footage taken from locations just minutes away. Timestamped within the same window. And what it shows is almost unsettling when you compare it to Brian's account. The water isn't choppy. It's not violent. There are no crashing waves. No white caps. Just light movement, the kind you'd expect from passing boats. At one point, you can see a dinghy gliding across the surface. Smoothly. No struggle. No resistance. Just a clean way cutting through calm water. And this isn't happening miles away. This is the same side of the island. The leeward side, the sheltered side, where the wind is naturally reduced. Which means the conditions Brian described should have been visible. Noticeable. Or at least confirmed by someone. But they aren't. No one reports waves between 2 and 4 feet. No one describes strong, disorienting wind. No one mentions poor visibility at the time. And that matters. Because Brian's version doesn't just include those details. It depends on them. Without rough water, there's no force strong enough to bounce someone off the back of a dinghy. Without strong wind, there's no reason the boat becomes uncontrollable so quickly. Without poor visibility, there's no clear explanation for losing sight of someone almost immediately. So now the story reaches a breaking point. Because either the ocean behaved in a way that no one else saw, or it didn't behave that way at all. And if it didn't, then the explanation for what happened that night has to come from somewhere else. Because Lynette is still missing. She's still gone. But if the water wasn't the cause, then what was? And if the water was calm, what actually caused Lynette to disappear? When something goes wrong at sea, there's one thing you can usually rely on. Patterns. Objects don't just move randomly. They follow the wind. They follow the current. And over time, those patterns tell a story. So in a case like this, even without a witness, the ocean itself should leave clues. And it does. But the problem is, those clues don't agree with each other. Let's start with the first object. The floaty. According to Brian, when Lynette went into the water, he grabbed a small flotation cushion and threw it toward her. He wasn't sure if she caught it, only that it ended up drifting away. Later, that same floaty is found on the shoreline, not miles away or scattered across open water. It ends up just about 100 yards from where Brian himself washes ashore. And at first, that almost sounds convincing. Because if he drifted overnight, maybe the floaty drifted with him. But then, there's the paddle. Brian says he lost one of the paddles during the incident. Another object carried away by the same wind, the same water, the same moment. Except that paddle doesn't end up anywhere near him. It's found far to the south, on Lubber's quarters, a completely different landing point. And now the pattern breaks. Because if both objects started in the same place, they should follow similar paths. Not identical, but similar. But here, one ends up near Brian. The other ends up miles away. And when you map the wind direction that night, something even more interesting happens. The wind was pushing southwest, which means drifting objects, especially one sitting high on the water like a dinghy or a cushion, should have been carried in that direction, straight toward Lubbers. Not north, not across open water or past it. But Brian says he drifted for hours and somehow bypassed that entire landmass before ending up further away at Marsh Harbor, which raises a problem. Because the paddle didn't miss Lubbers. It went exactly where the wind would take it. And that's when the explanation starts to split. One object follows the expected path. Another follows Brian, and the boat itself ends up somewhere else entirely. 3 objects. Same origin. 3 different endings. Now, to be fair, there are factors that can affect drift. Some objects sit lower in the water. Some catch more wind. Some move with current more than air. But even with those differences, you would still expect some level of consistency. And here, there isn't any. Instead, what you see is a pattern that doesn't behave like a single event. It behaves like multiple paths, coming from different starting points. And that's when the question changes again. Because now it's not just about what happened. It's about where things actually began. If all the objects started in the same place, why didn't they end up together? By now, the inconsistencies aren't subtle anymore. The timeline doesn't hold. The environment doesn't match. And the objects don't follow the same path. But there's one detail that feels smaller at first, until you realize it might be one of the most revealing. The dry bag. In Brian's version of events, this bag is critical. It's not just something he was carrying. It supposedly contains keys, personal items, possibly their phones, even passports. And more importantly, it's directly tied to the moment Lynette disappears. Because he claims, when she went overboard, she took the dry bag with her, which already creates a problem, because later he's seen holding one. But that's not even the strangest part. The real issue isn't whether he had a bag. It's what that bag looked like. When Brian first appears at the shoreline, witnesses describe him carrying a yellow dry bag. Bright, distinct, easy to remember. But when rescuers pick him up, the descriptions begin to change. One remembers the bag as aqua, another describes it as bluish. And someone else still insists it was yellow. Same person. Same morning. Different colors. Now, memory isn't perfect. People can misremember small details. But this isn't a subtle difference. Yellow isn't blue, blue isn't aqua. These are distinct, unmistakable colors. And what makes it even more interesting is what one rescuer says happened next. According to him, when they reached the sailboat, Brian took the bag and threw it up onto the back of the boat. He didn't hand it over or set it down carefully. Then, after boarding, he begins moving around the boat, accessing areas, handling things. And at some point, that bag is no longer with him. Which raises a possibility that's hard to ignore. Because if witnesses saw different colors, there are only a few explanations. Either people are remembering incorrectly, there were multiple bags, or something about the bag changed over time. And there's one theory that tries to connect those dots. That one bag may have been inside another. A larger one. A smaller one. Something removed. Something rearranged. It would explain the shift in appearance. It would explain why different people saw different colors. And it would explain why the timeline of the bag doesn't stay consistent. But here's the bigger issue. This bag is supposed to represent chaos. A moment where everything went wrong. A situation where Brian lost control. And yet, the bag itself looks like something that was handled. Possibly even organized. Not lost in panic or drifting in confusion. And when an object tied to the key moment in a story starts changing details depending on who saw it, it stops being background noise. It becomes a clue. Because if this was all one continuous event, then the bag should have one clear identity. But it doesn't. And that leaves us with a question that shouldn't exist. Unless something in the sequence has been altered, why would the same bag appear as different colors to multiple witnesses? At this point, we've looked at what Brian said happened. We've looked at what the environment suggests. And we've looked at the physical evidence. But now, we need to look at something quieter. Something less obvious but just as important. What Brian didn't say. Because when someone goes missing at sea, every detail matters. Especially the simplest ones. What were they wearing? What colors? What stood out? These aren't small questions. They're the foundation of any search. Because when rescuers are scanning open water, they're not looking for a name. They're looking for something visible. Something recognizable. And in Lynette's case, there were plenty of details to give. We know this because of the photos taken shortly before she disappeared. She's wearing a bright blue headscarf. It wasn't subtle or neutral. It was bright. She has on a green cover-up. Something that would stand out against the water. There's what appears to be a black fanny pack. Possibly worn at the waist. And likely, sunglasses. All of these are visible and distinct. And all of these could help someone spot her. So when rescuers asked Brian a simple question, what was she wearing? His answer was minimal. A black two-piece bathing suit. And that was it. No mention of the headscarf. No mention of the cover-up. No mention of anything else that would make her easier to find. And it wasn't for lack of opportunity. According to the people involved in the search, they asked him more than once. Pressed for details. They tried to get anything that could help. But the answer didn't change. Now, people respond differently under stress. Memory can blur. Details can slip. But here's the part that makes this stand out. These aren't hidden details. They're not subtle. They are not things you'd struggle to recall. They're the most visible things about her. The kind of details you'd picture immediately. Especially if you just saw someone moments before they disappeared. And that's what creates the tension. Because if Brian's timeline is accurate, then Lynette was right in front of him. Just minutes earlier. Close enough to interact, to notice. Close enough to remember. And yet, when it mattered most, those details never made it into his description. Which leaves us with a question that feels simple, but gets harder to answer the longer you sit with it. If he saw her moments before she vanished, how did he forget so much? By now, the contradictions have a pattern. The timeline doesn't align. The ocean doesn't support the story. The objects don't move the way they should. But this is different. Because this isn't about interpretation. It's not about memory. It's not even about physics. It's about something that was either somewhere or wasn't. Lynette's Apple Watch. In one of the final photos taken that evening, Lynette is standing by the pool. Relaxed. Smiling. And on her wrist, clear as day, is a light-colored Apple Watch. One that had been seen in previous photos. It's one of the last confirmed details of her appearance. And at that point, she hasn't left yet. She hasn't gotten into the dinghy, nothing has happened. The watch is still with her. Now hold on to that. Because according to Brian's version of events, Lynette never makes it back to the boat. She falls off the dinghy. She disappears into the water. Brian loses sight of her. End of story. Which means everything she had on her should have gone with her, including that watch. But it didn't. Because later, when authorities searched the sailboat, they found it. Her Apple Watch was on board like it never left. And suddenly, this isn't just a detail anymore. It's a contradiction. Because if Lynette never made it back, then neither should anything she was wearing. Especially something like a watch. Apple Watches aren't loose items. They don't fall off easily, they're strapped. Secure. Worn tightly enough to track heart rate, movement, sleep. They don't just slip off during an accident. And even if they did, they wouldn't magically return to the one place she never reached. Unless, at some point, she did. And there's another layer to this. One that makes the timing even more interesting. According to her daughter, that specific watch had a weak battery. It wouldn't last through the night. It usually needed to be charged sometime in the evening, after dinner, after being out during the day. Which means, if Lynette followed her normal routine, there's a moment where she would have taken it off. And where would that happen? Not in the water or mid-accident. On the boat. And suddenly, this isn't just about where the watch was found. It's about what had to happen for it to be there. Because now, there are only two possibilities. Either the watch somehow separated from her in the water and made its way back to the sailboat on its own, or Lynette made it back to the boat. And at some point after that, the story changed. Because once you accept that the watch was on board, you're no longer asking what happened in the ocean. You're asking what happened before or after she ever got there. And that leads to a question that shifts the entire direction of the case. If she never reached the boat, how did her watch get there? If the physical evidence raises questions, the digital evidence has the potential to answer them. Unlike memory, data doesn't forget. And in a case like this, every device becomes a witness. Lynette's Apple Watch wasn't just a watch. It was connected, synced to her iPhone, linked through apps. There was constant communication in the background. Every movement, every connection, every signal. And if that watch ended up on the boat, then there's a chance it left something behind. What investigators call digital exhaust. Tiny records of activity. Silent logs of where a device has been, or what it connected to. Now, here's where things get more interesting. The sailboat wasn't offline. It had Starlink internet mounted high above on the mast. And that matters. Because of a higher antenna means a wider reach. Devices don't need to be right next to it to connect. They can establish a signal from a distance. Which means, if Lynette, or even just her devices, came within range of that boat, there's a possibility they connected. And if they connected, there may be a record, a timestamp, a moment where the system recognizes something is here. Now think about what that means. If her watch and phone were still out in open water, they shouldn't be connecting to anything. But if they came close enough, or actually made it onto the boat, they might. And that connection, even if it lasted seconds, could completely change the timeline. Because now you're not relying on what someone says happened. You're looking at what the devices themselves recorded. And it doesn't stop there. Brian had a watch too. Not just any watch, but a more advanced one. A Mariner-style device. Something capable of tracking navigation, logging routes, possibly recording movement across water. The kind of device that could answer questions like, where was he? How far did he drift? What path did he take? But that information was never clearly presented. And that leaves a gap. Because in a case built on movement, on drifting across miles of water, the one thing that could map that journey is missing from the story. Which brings everything back to the same point. The devices were there. The systems were active. The data could exist. And if it does, it won't care about the version of events anyone tells. It will only reflect what actually happened. And that leads to a question that feels less like speculation and more like a direction. If the device is connected to the boat, does that mean someone brought them there? At the beginning of this story, everything seemed simple. A fall, a current, a woman lost at sea. But the deeper you go, the less it feels like a single story, and the more it feels like something that's been forced to fit. Because nothing here lines up cleanly. The timeline doesn't. There's a gap. A window where Lynette simply disappears from view. Seen at 6:38. Gone by 7 o'clock. And in between? No clear answer. The environment doesn't. What was described as chaos looks calm. Water that should have been dangerous appears almost still. The objects don't. A floaty ending up in one place. A paddle somewhere else entirely. A drift path that doesn't follow a single direction, but splits. The details don't. The things that should have been obvious weren't said. The things that should have helped weren't mentioned. And then there's the watch. Still one of the simplest questions in this entire case. And somehow the hardest to answer, because it shouldn't be there. If Lynette never made it back, that watch shouldn't have either. And yet, it did. And when one detail breaks the story, you look closer. But when everything begins to break it, you start asking a different question. Not what happened, but what part of this was ever true? Because this isn't just a story with missing pieces anymore. It's a story where the pieces exist, but refuse to fit together. And when that happens, when the timeline fractures, evidence disagrees, when the smallest details carry the biggest weight, the answer usually isn't hidden in what's missing. It's hidden in what's already there. You just have to look at it differently. So now, after everything you've seen, everything that doesn't align, everything that raises more questions than it answers, there's only one thing left to ask. Which version of this story are we really looking at? We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything.